I never imagined that my time working as a journalist would bring me face to face with the darkest depths of human depravity. But that's exactly what happened when I first heard about Joe Metheny, a name that would forever be etched into my memory. His story, one of horror and brutality, still haunts me to this day. Joe Metheny was an unassuming name in South Baltimore, Maryland, during the early 1990s. He worked as a truck driver, a profession that kept him constantly on the move, never staying in one place for too long. He was a big man, standing at 6 feet tall, with a bulky frame that could be intimidating to those who didn't know him. But to those who did, he was just Joe, a guy who loved his family and his job. However, Joe's life took a dark turn in the summer of 1994. His wife, who was addicted to crack cocaine, suddenly left him and took their young son with her. This event seemed to push Joe over the edge. The rage and desperation he felt were palpable. It was as if a switch had been flipped, turning him from a hard-working man into a monster. For 6 months, Joe searched relentlessly for his estranged wife and son. He made countless inquiries, desperate to find them. Eventually, he discovered that his ex-wife had been living under a bridge at the Patapsco River with an unknown man. Fueled by anger, he went to the location, hoping to confront her and bring his son home. But when he arrived, he found 2 random homeless people instead. In a fit of blind rage, Joe attacked them, chopping them down with an axe. That same day, his path of destruction continued. He lured 2 sex workers to the same bridge, suspecting they might know his wife. They met the same gruesome fate. As Joe was about to dump the bodies, he noticed a man fishing by the river. Paranoia set in, and he feared being discovered. So, he killed the fisherman too, beating him to death. In just 7 hours, Joe Metheny had killed 5 people. The sheer brutality of his actions was staggering. He later took investigators to the spot where he had dumped the bodies, but no remains were found. Without the physical evidence, they couldn't charge him for those murders. But Joe's reign of terror was far from over. By 1995, Joe's crimes had escalated in both frequency and brutality. He began luring prostitutes to his trailer park home, which was situated inside the compound of the company he worked for. This was where he committed some of his most heinous acts. He subjected these women to unimaginable horrors before killing them. Kathy Magazaner and Kimberly Spicer were among his victims, both stabbed to death by Joe. During this time, Joe was also operating a small open-pit barbecue business near the company compound. It was a popular spot for locals who had no idea of the gruesome truth behind the food they were consuming. Joe would grind up the remains of his victims, mixing them with pork and beef meat, and sell them as sandwiches to his unsuspecting patrons. The thought of it still makes my stomach churn. Joe's eventual capture came in 1996. He had kidnapped and brutally assaulted another prostitute, Rita Kemper. By some miracle, she managed to escape from Joe's trailer and alerted the authorities. Her escape was the break the police needed. They arrested Joe and brought him to trial. Joe's arrest and trial were heavily covered by the media, turning him into a household name. As details of his crimes emerged, the public's fascination grew. People wanted to understand how a seemingly ordinary man could commit such heinous acts. The courtroom was packed with spectators, all eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had terrorized their community. During the trial, Joe's lack of remorse was evident. He described his actions with a disturbing level of detail, almost as if he were recounting a favorite pastime. His claims of enjoying the murders and his regret at not being able to kill his estranged wife were shocking. It was clear that Joe Metheny was not just a killer, but a true psychopath. Joe Metheny was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He spent the rest of his days behind bars, where he remained a haunting reminder of the evil that can lurk within a person. In 2017, Maryland corrections officials reported that Joe Metheny had died at the age of 62. The cause of his death remains unknown, but many believe it was due to natural causes. I've covered many stories, but none have left as lasting an impression as the tale of Joe Metheny. His story is a stark reminder of the darkness that can reside within the human soul. It's a tale that I'll never forget, and one that serves as a grim warning to us all. The early 90s in South Baltimore were a time of change and uncertainty. The city, known for its blue-collar roots and gritty charm, was also struggling with rising crime rates and a growing drug epidemic. Joe Metheny was a product of this environment, a man whose life had spiraled out of control, leading to a series of events that would shock the community to its core. Joe's transformation from a hardworking truck driver to a notorious killer didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual descent into madness, fueled by the betrayal and loss he felt when his wife left him. The pain of losing his family, combined with the easy availability of drugs, created a perfect storm that unleashed the monster within. I remember visiting the Patapsco River Bridge, the site of Joe's first known murders. It was a quiet, unassuming place, far removed from the horrors that had occurred there. Standing under the bridge, I could almost hear the echoes of Joe's rage, the desperation in his actions. The thought that this tranquil spot had been the scene of such brutality was hard to reconcile. I've been a police officer in the quiet, sleepy town of Westfield, South Jersey, for the better part of a decade. It's the kind of place where nothing much happens, where life moseys along at a pace as slow as molasses in January. I became a cop at 23, full of ambition and fueled by the adrenaline of youth. But as the years went by, I settled into the routine of it all, the excitement giving way to the mundane reality of disturbance calls, shoplifting incidents, and the occasional more serious crime that would crop up just often enough to remind us that danger was never too far away. Most days, especially on the night shift, it's pretty uneventful. The night shift brings out the oddities of the town, sure, but rarely anything more than a few drunks stumbling out of the local bar, or a raccoon getting into someone's trash. I've worked all the possible shifts, mornings, afternoons, and the dreaded nights. Each has its own rhythm, its own set of expectations and surprises. One particularly quiet night, I found myself cruising down an unlit back road flanked by dense woods on either side. The road, aptly named Whispering Pines Road, had always given me a bit of a chill, even on the most ordinary of nights. The shadows cast by the moonlight seemed to dance menacingly among the trees, and the silence was so profound it felt almost oppressive. It was the kind of place where you couldn't help but feel that the woods were watching you, waiting for something to happen. As I drove, lost in the monotony of my patrol, a sudden flash of red caught my eye, a reflection of taillights off to the right, just beyond the tree line. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what I was seeing. It was a car, parked awkwardly on the grass, its driver's side door wide open. Instinct kicked in, and I veered onto the grass, my cruiser coming to a stop a few feet from the vehicle. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, the cool night air hitting me like a wave. As I approached the car, I saw a figure step out from behind the open door. For a moment, they just stood there, as if deciding what to do next. Then, without warning, they bolted into the woods. My training took over, and I radioed in the code for a suspicious person or vehicle before cautiously moving towards the car. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior of the car. The first thing that hit me was the smell, a pungent, rotting odor that made my stomach churn. It was the unmistakable scent of death, something I'd encountered a few times in my career but never got used to. I called out into the woods, my voice echoing back at me, but there was no response, just the eerie silence of the forest. I peered inside the car, expecting the worst. The front seats were empty, but the passenger side was a different story. Bloodied tissues and paper towels were strewn across the floor and back seats, each one soaked a dark, ominous red. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a routine call. Something terrible had happened here. My heart pounded in my chest as I heard footsteps rustling in the woods behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand on my holster, ready for anything. "Come out of the woods," I shouted, my voice trembling slightly. I heard a deep voice, indistinguishable, coming from beyond the trees. It didn't sound like someone in pain, but it didn't sound friendly either. "Show yourself. Are you hurt?" I called out again, taking a cautious step towards the tree line. The silence that followed was deafening. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this person the victim or the perpetrator? Why had they run? The lack of response only heightened my anxiety. Something was seriously wrong. I went back to the car, my senses on high alert. I needed to find out more about what I was dealing with. As I examined the back of the car, my flashlight beam fell upon something heavy wrapped in blood-soaked paper towels. My heart sank as I unwrapped it, revealing a severed hand. Its fingers curled in a grotesque mockery of life. The sight was so shocking, so visceral, that I nearly gagged. The situation had escalated from eerie to outright terrifying. I radioed in for backup, my voice steadier than I felt. "Possible murder. Need immediate assistance," I said, my hands trembling slightly. I turned on my cruiser's lights to help the other officers locate me more easily. The bright red and blue lights cut through the darkness, a beacon of hope in the midst of the unfolding nightmare. When backup finally arrived, we launched a thorough search of the woods, combing every inch for any sign of the person I had seen. Hours passed, the darkness slowly giving way to the pale light of dawn, but we found nothing. No blood trails, no evidence, nothing. It was as if the person had vanished into thin air. The canine unit was brought in, but even they turned up empty-handed. The car was taken into custody, and an investigation was launched. It turned out the vehicle had been reported stolen from a nearby town. The owner, a middle-aged man named Frank Thompson, had no idea who could have taken his car or why. The fingerprints collected from the steering wheel and the DNA from the severed hand yielded no matches in the database. It was a dead end. Despite our best efforts, the case went cold. The incident haunted me for weeks, the image of that severed hand seared into my memory. I kept replaying the night over and over in my mind, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, some clue I had missed. The uncertainty, the not knowing, gnawed at me. I spoke to Frank several times during the investigation. He was a soft-spoken man, clearly shaken by the whole ordeal. He had lived in Westfield his entire life and had never experienced anything like this. He couldn't fathom why someone would steal his car, let alone use it in such a gruesome crime. In the mid-1970s, life felt like an open road filled with endless possibilities. I was in my early 20s, full of hope and excitement about the future. One of my greatest joys was exploring nature with my girlfriend, now my wife, Emily. We loved taking long walks, discovering new trails, and losing ourselves in the beauty of the great outdoors. Little did we know that one of these peaceful outings would turn into a nightmare that would haunt us forever. It was a warm, sunny day in Colorado, the kind that makes you feel alive and grateful for the simple things. We decided to explore a new forest trail that we had heard about from friends. It was supposed to be stunning, with tall, ancient trees, lush undergrowth, and an abundance of wildlife. We packed a light lunch, grabbed our hiking boots, and set off for what we thought would be a memorable adventure. The trailhead was a little off the beaten path, but we managed to find it after a short drive. The forest welcomed us with open arms, its canopy providing a cool, shaded refuge from the summer sun. We walked hand in hand, chatting about our dreams and plans, marveling at the vibrant colors and the symphony of birdsong that surrounded us. It was one of those days where everything seemed perfect, where the world felt just right. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the trail became narrower and less defined. We didn't mind. It only added to the sense of adventure. The trees grew taller and denser, their branches intertwining to form a natural cathedral. The air was fresh and filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and moss. We felt like we were the only two people in the world, completely enveloped by nature. After a couple of hours, we decided to take a break and have our lunch by a small, babbling brook. We sat on a large, flat rock, dipping our toes into the cool water, and enjoyed our simple meal. We laughed, shared stories, and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Little did we know that this idyllic moment was the calm before the storm. As we packed up and continued our hike, we noticed a faint, unpleasant odor. At first, it was barely noticeable, but as we walked, it grew stronger and more distinct. It smelled like rotting flesh, an unmistakable and stomach-churning scent. We exchanged uneasy glances but didn't say anything, each of us hoping it was just a dead animal somewhere nearby. We pressed on, but the smell only intensified. It became so overpowering that it was hard to ignore. We reached an area where the forest floor was littered with rocks and tall grass, and the trees grew even thicker. It was then that I stepped on something soft and heavy. The moment my foot made contact, the smell hit me like a freight train. It was so unbearable that I gagged and had to fight the urge to vomit. Emily, who was a few steps behind me, could smell it too, but she didn't have the same visceral reaction since she wasn't as close. She saw the look on my face and knew something was terribly wrong. I knelt down to see what I had stepped on, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw is something I will never forget for as long as I live. Lying there, partially hidden by the grass and rocks, was the mutilated corpse of a woman. Her body was bloody and torn apart, her face so disfigured that it was unrecognizable. The sight was so horrific that I felt my legs go weak. I stumbled back, trying to process what I was seeing. Emily screamed, a sound that echoed through the trees and sent shivers down my spine. In that moment of shock and disbelief, I heard a twig snap somewhere beyond the trees. My instincts kicked in, and I yelled to Emily to run. We didn't wait to see who or what had made the noise. We turned and sprinted back down the trail, our hearts racing, fear propelling us forward. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something chasing us. We ran for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 15 minutes. When we finally emerged from the forest, we collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. We looked at each other, our faces pale and our bodies trembling. We didn't say anything for a while, just sat there, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, we made our way back home, but the horror of that day stayed with us. We debated calling the police, but in our state of shock and fear, we convinced ourselves that it wouldn't matter. We believed that by the time the authorities got there, the body and whoever was responsible would be long gone. It was a decision that would haunt me for years to come. For months, we were both haunted by what we had seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that mutilated body. Every time I heard a twig snap or smelled something foul, I was transported back to that forest. We tried to move on with our lives, but the memory lingered, a dark cloud over our happiness. It wasn't until 1979 that the true horror of that day came rushing back with a vengeance. I was sitting in our living room, watching TV, when a news program came on about the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. He was being interviewed, and at one point, he was asked when he had felt the closest to being caught. His response made my blood run cold. Bundy described an incident from a few years earlier when he had lured a young woman into a forest in Colorado. He had stabbed her and mutilated her body, and then hidden when he heard two people approaching. He watched as one of them knelt down and discovered the body, and then tried to sneak away but stepped on a twig. He said he was sure the guy would come after him, but instead, he ran away with his girlfriend. I sat there in stunned silence, realizing that I had come face to face with one of the most infamous killers in history. The woman we had found was one of Ted Bundy's victims. The thought was almost too much to bear. It brought back all the fear and horror of that day, but now with the added weight of knowing just how close we had come to becoming victims ourselves. In the picturesque, rolling countryside of Washington State, about 7 miles east of Seattle, sat a quaint farm owned by the Barlow brothers, Richard and David. These two men liked to think of themselves as simple country folk, living off the land and selling their produce in the bustling city markets. For many years, their small farm was a symbol of the idyllic, quiet life, where hard work met the rewards of nature. Their days were spent tending to their crops, caring for their animals, and selling their goods at the local markets. In the mid-90s, however, things began to change. The Barlow brothers, once diligent and focused, started neglecting their farm duties. The vibrant fields of vegetables began to wilt, the animals appeared less cared for, and the once bustling farm grew eerily quiet. Richard, in particular, exhibited bizarre mood swings that unsettled not only his brother, but also the few farmhands who worked there. Bill Haskins, one of their longtime employees, noted that Richard used to be a quiet, hardworking man. But as the years went by, his behavior grew increasingly erratic and frightening. Bill recalled how the farm began to take on a sinister atmosphere, yet he stayed on, needing the money too much to consider leaving. Instead of redoubling their efforts to restore the farm to its former glory, the Barlow brothers concocted a scheme that would lead them down a dark and twisted path. In 1996, they registered a non-profit organization with the U.S. government, grandiosely naming it the Piggy Palace Good Time Society. Their mission statement claimed they would organize, coordinate, manage, and operate special events, functions, dances, shows, and exhibitions on behalf of various service organizations and other worthy groups. The government, seeing this as a benevolent venture, approved a grant to support their activities. But the Barlow brothers had no intention of using this money for charitable causes. Instead, they converted an old slaughterhouse on their property into a party venue. What followed were wild, raucous gatherings that attracted unsavory characters, including members of the local motorcycle gang and numerous escorts from Seattle. These parties became notorious, with some events drawing as many as 2,000 people. The once peaceful farm transformed into a place of debauchery and lawlessness. The parties, however, got out of hand. On March 23, 1997, Richard Barlow was arrested by the Seattle Police Department on charges of attempted murder. The alleged victim, an escort named Wendy Lynn Esposito, had been stabbed multiple times during an altercation at one of the farm's many wild events. Richard claimed the stabbing was in self-defense, asserting that Wendy had attacked him with a broken bottle. His injuries seemed to support this story, but Wendy's account was starkly different. She alleged that Richard had tried to handcuff and kidnap her, and she had only attacked him after he threatened her with a knife. She managed to disarm him and used the knife to defend herself, resulting in Richard's injuries. Despite the serious nature of the allegations, the case did not result in a conviction. Both Richard and Wendy had sustained injuries, leading the police and judicial officials to conclude it was a mutual altercation rather than a clear-cut case of attempted murder. By January 1998, the charges were dismissed. The negative publicity, however, forced the Barlow brothers to shut down the Piggy Palace Good Time Society, especially after a federal financial committee revoked its nonprofit status due to the inability to provide financial statements. But fraud, zoning violations, and wild parties were not the only dark secrets at the Barlow farm. Bill Haskins, the farmhand who had stayed on despite the unsettling changes, began to notice something even more disturbing. Over the years, he observed that many young women who visited the farm seemed to disappear. They would arrive, often asking for work or to pick fruit, and Richard would welcome them with a smile. Yet, despite seeing these women enter the farmhouse, Bill rarely saw them leave. His suspicions grew, but he had no concrete evidence to act upon. It wasn't until February 6, 2002, that the truth began to emerge. On that day, the Seattle police executed a search warrant for illegal firearms at the Barlow farm. Richard and David were rumored to be involved in weapons trafficking in partnership with the motorcycle gang. During the search, police discovered something far more sinister than unlicensed guns. They found personal items belonging to several missing women, prompting them to seal off the farm and conduct a thorough excavation. Specialist forensic investigators were brought in to dig through the farm's grounds. They soon uncovered a horrifying scene. The bodies of multiple women were found buried in the farm, some having been there for years. The police were slow to release information to the public, but the grim discoveries kept mounting. On February 22nd, Richard Barlow was arrested and charged with the murders of two women, Sarah Appleton and Mona Williams. Over the following weeks, more charges were added as investigators uncovered additional remains. By May 26, 2005, Richard faced 27 charges of first-degree murder. The investigation into the Barlow farm became the largest serial killer investigation in U.S. history, costing millions of dollars. The process of forensic analysis and victim identification was painstaking and drawn out due to the condition of the remains. Some bodies had been underground for so long that identification required complex methods. Others had been fed to the farm's pigs, which explained why the farm's animals had remained unusually well fed despite the neglect. Amidst the horror, more disturbing revelations came to light. In March 2004, the U.S. government issued a statement suggesting that Richard may have mixed human flesh with pork and sold it to the public. This claim was later confirmed by local health authorities, sending shockwaves through the community. Witnesses began coming forward, including a woman named Lisa Ellington, who claimed to have seen Richard skinning a woman hanging from a meat hook years earlier. She had kept silent out of fear for her life, but admitted to blackmailing Richard on multiple occasions. The items found inside Richard's trailer painted a chilling picture of his disturbed mind. Police discovered a loaded .22 revolver with a homemade silencer, boxes of ammunition, night vision goggles, handcuffs lined with fox fur, a syringe filled with a mysterious blue liquid, and a bottle of Spanish fly aphrodisiac. Even more disturbingly, they found videotapes of Richard's friends discussing ways to kill women, including injecting them with windshield washer fluid. On December 11, 2007, after a lengthy trial, Richard Barlow was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. The farm, once a symbol of pastoral life, was now a crime scene. By 2015, the property had been fenced off and all buildings, except a small barn, had been demolished. It stood as a grim reminder of the horrors that had taken place there. The Barlow brothers' story shattered the idyllic image of rural America. It highlighted the potential for darkness in even the most seemingly peaceful settings. The farm, which once appeared to be a haven of simplicity and hard work, had become a cemetery for vulnerable young women whose lives were brutally cut short. In the end, the Barlow farm was more than just a piece of land. It was a testament to the evil that can lurk behind closed doors, a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving. As America came to terms with the shocking crimes, the story of the Barlow brothers served as a warning that beneath the surface of everyday life, unimaginable horrors can unfold, and that sometimes the monsters we fear are not lurking in the shadows, but living among us.